Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in New Orleans history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the sweltering summer of 1838, when New Orleans was a patchwork of French, Spanish, and American influences, a promise was made on Burgundy Street that would echo through generations. The disappearance of Nathaniel Budro, a respected cotton merchant, and Adeline Harper, a woman recently granted her freedom, sent ripples through the city's rigid social structure. What began as whispers in the Garden District grew into something far more sinister when investigators found an abandoned carriage at the edge of Bayou St. John, the seats stained with what appeared to be ink, or possibly something darker. According to parish records recovered during a courthouse renovation in 1962, Nathaniel Budro had purchased the freedom of Adeline Harper just 3 days before they both vanished. The document, yellowed and water-damaged, bore both their signatures and the seal of a notary public named James Wilson, who would later claim never to have met either party. This contradiction was merely the first thread in an unraveling tapestry of half-truths and silence that would blanket the case for over a century. The Budro family mansion still stands on Prytania Street, though it has changed hands dozens of times since 1838. Local historians note that no owner has remained for longer than 7 years. Real estate records from the period show that the property was valued well above market rates, yet repeatedly sold at a loss. Former residents interviewed for a 1968 article in the Times-Picayune described an oppressive stillness that seemed to settle over certain rooms, particularly the library and what was once the master bedroom on the second floor. Before the events of August 1838, the Budro family enjoyed a position of considerable influence in New Orleans society. Nathaniel, at 42 years old, was the eldest son of a French immigrant who had amassed a fortune in the cotton trade. Business correspondence preserved in the Williams Research Center indicates that the family's connections extended to Paris, London, and New York. The Budro name appeared regularly in social announcements, their parties notable for extravagance, even in a city known for its excesses. What we know of Adeline Harper comes primarily from bills of sale and a single diary entry written by Elizabeth Budro, Nathaniel's mother. The entry, dated April 12, 1837, mentions the girl with the unusual eyes, who had been purchased from a plantation in St. Bernard Parish. Elizabeth noted that her son had paid an unreasonable sum for Adeline, who was described as literate and skilled in household management. The diary makes no further mention of her, though household accounts show increased expenditures for fabrics and a modiste in the months leading up to the disappearance. The social circles of New Orleans were carefully stratified in the 1830s, with rigid boundaries between white society, free people of color, and enslaved individuals. According to historian Dr. Margaret Calloway, whose 1961 monograph, Whispers from the Quarter, remains one of the most comprehensive examinations of the period, relationships that crossed these boundaries were not unknown, but they existed in shadows. They were discussed in hushed tones behind closed doors, acknowledged with meaningful glances at social gatherings, but never spoken of openly. The summer of 1838 was unusually hot, even by Louisiana standards. Newspaper accounts from July describe the streets as nearly deserted during daylight hours, with business conducted primarily in the relative cool of early morning or after sunset. It was in this stifling atmosphere that Nathaniel Budro began to withdraw from his usual social engagements. Invitations were declined, business meetings postponed. According to correspondence between Elizabeth Budro and her sister in Baltimore, discovered during the 1958 renovation of the family crypt, Nathaniel had become distracted and secretive, often locked away in his study for hours at a time. It was during this period that Adeline Harper's status changed. The manumission papers, filed on August 10th, 1838, transferred ownership of one female slave, Adeline, approximately 23 years of age, to Adeline Harper herself. The document bears the signatures of both Nathaniel and Adeline, the latter signed with a surprisingly elegant hand for someone who had been denied formal education. 3 days later, both Nathaniel and Adeline disappeared. The initial investigation was perfunctory at best. According to police reports archived in the city records, Elizabeth Budro reported her son missing on August 16th, 3 days after he failed to appear at a business meeting. The report makes no mention of Adeline Harper. When questioned later, Elizabeth would claim she had been unaware of the woman's manumission or her son's apparent intentions. The investigating officer, a Lieutenant Robert Murphy, noted that the family seemed more concerned with discretion than discovery. The abandoned carriage discovered near Bayou St. John on August 20th provided the first tangible evidence that something beyond a scandalous elopement might have occurred. The vehicle was identified as belonging to the Budro family by its distinctive crest. Inside, investigators found a man's hat, presumed to be Nathaniel's, and a small valise containing women's clothing. Most disturbing was the dark staining on the upholstery, initially described as ink, but later amended in the report as substance of unknown origin. No further forensic examination was documented. The case might have faded entirely from public record were it not for a letter discovered in 1959 during the demolition of an old boarding house on Rampart Street. The letter, written in a careful hand on expensive paper, was addressed to my dearest A, and signed simply N. Its contents spoke of a plan to depart for France, where they might live openly as man and wife without the burden of society's constraints. The letter was dated August 12th, 1838, the day before the disappearance. It ended with a curious postscript. Beware the one who watches from the shadows. He has made his intentions clear. This reference to an unknown third party shifted the narrative from one of forbidden love to something potentially more sinister. Subsequent research by amateur historian William Crawford in 1963 uncovered business correspondence suggesting that Nathaniel Budro had been involved in a dispute with several prominent merchants in the weeks before his disappearance. According to Crawford's notes, published posthumously in 1967, the dispute centered around shipping routes and allegations of price manipulation. One letter, written by merchant Thomas Reynolds, contained what might be interpreted as a veiled threat. Your recent decisions reflect a concerning lack of judgment. One might wonder what other areas of your life suffer from similar impairment. The Reynolds family was among New Orleans' oldest and most influential. Their residence on Esplanade Avenue was just a short distance from the Budro home, and social records indicate that the families moved in the same circles. Thomas Reynolds had a daughter, Caroline, who, according to a society column in the Picayune from January 1838, was expected to make a match with the eligible Mr. Budro before the year's end. No formal engagement was ever announced. The connections between the Reynolds family and the disappearances remained unexplored for decades. It was not until 1957 that a graduate student named James Landry, researching antebellum business practices for his dissertation, stumbled upon accounting ledgers belonging to the Reynolds Shipping Company. Hidden among routine entries were payments to individuals identified only by initials, with notations that Landry interpreted as coordinates along the Mississippi River. One entry, dated August 14th, 1838, read simply, "J.M., final payment, package secured." Landry's research was never published. According to university records, he abandoned his dissertation in 1958 after what colleagues described as an episode of extreme paranoia. He left New Orleans abruptly, reportedly telling his academic advisor that he felt constantly watched. His subsequent whereabouts remained unknown until a brief obituary appeared in a Minneapolis newspaper in 1966, noting that Landry had struggled with mental health issues in the years following his departure from Louisiana. The JM referenced in the ledger might have been James Monroe, a figure known in New Orleans police records as a man of special talents, occasionally employed by wealthy families when conventional methods proved insufficient. Monroe's name appears in connection with several investigations throughout the 1830s and 40s, though he was never formally charged with any crime. Census records indicate that he resided on Dauphine Street, less than half a mile from both the Budro and Reynolds homes. What happened on the night of August 13, 1838, remains largely speculative. The carriage was found approximately 7 miles from the city centre, in an area that would have been isolated and heavily wooded at the time. No bodies were ever recovered, despite a search that, according to police reports, covered the surrounding swampland and adjacent waterways. The search was abandoned after 5 days, with Lieutenant Murphy noting that further expenditure of resources seems unwarranted given the circumstances. The circumstances, as delicately phrased in the report, likely referred to the social complications of the case. A prominent white businessman disappearing with a woman recently freed from enslavement was scandalous enough to warrant discretion. If, as the evidence suggests, there were financial and social entanglements with other powerful families, the motivation to quietly close the investigation would have been even stronger. In 1841, Elizabeth Budro commissioned a memorial stone in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, though no remains were interred. The simple marker bears only Nathaniel's name and the dates of his birth and presumed death. No public acknowledgement of Adeline Harper's fate was ever made by the family. The Budro business interests were gradually liquidated over the following decade, with Elizabeth eventually returning to her family in Baltimore. She died there in 1853, leaving behind a sealed letter addressed to her deceased son, which remains in the collection of the Maryland Historical Society. The contents of this letter were not made public until 1960, when researcher Catherine Martin was granted access as part of a broader study on antebellum family correspondence. According to Martin's notes, Elizabeth wrote of her deep regret for actions taken in haste and misguided concern for our family's position. She asked forgiveness for allowing fear to overcome maternal love and for listening to those who claimed to have our interests at heart. Most tellingly, she wrote, "I know now that the darkness that descended that night was of our own making, not yours." This oblique reference suggests that Elizabeth may have had knowledge of, or perhaps even involvement in whatever befell her son and Adeline Harper. The darkness she referenced might have been metaphorical, a reference to the family's fall from social prominence following the scandal. However, when considered alongside the other evidence, it raises the possibility of a more literal interpretation. Local folklore has preserved another dimension of the story, one absent from official records. According to tales collected by anthropologist Marie Devereaux in 1955, residents of the area around Bayou Saint. One account, provided by an elderly woman whose grandmother had lived nearby in the 1830s, described a lady in white who walks among the cypress trees, searching for something she will never find. Another mentioned the sound of carriage wheels on nights when the moon is new, moving along a road that no longer exists. Such stories are common in a city as steeped in history as New Orleans, and Devereaux noted that they should be regarded as cultural artifacts rather than historical evidence. John spoke of restless spirits near the site where the carriage was found, Nevertheless, they speak to the way in which the disappearance of Nathaniel Budro and Adeline Harper embedded itself in the collective memory of the community, transforming over time from scandal to legend. In 1959, construction workers preparing to build a new road near the original Bayou site uncovered what was described in their report as a collection of personal effects buried approximately 3 feet below the surface. The items included a pocket watch with the initials NB engraved on the case, several coins dating from the 1830s, and fragments of what appeared to be a woman's hair comb. The location was approximately 50 yards from where the carriage had been found more than a century earlier. The discovery prompted a brief renewal of interest in the case. The Times-Picayune ran a feature article titled "Century-Old Mystery Resurfaces," which summarized the known facts and speculated about possible explanations. The artifacts were transferred to the Louisiana State Museum, where they remained in storage, largely forgotten, until historian Robert Bell requested access in 1967 as part of research for his book Silence Narratives, Lost Voices of the Antebellum South. Bell's examination of the pocket watch revealed an inscription inside the case that had not been noted in the original inventory. To NB, may time be kind to our future, AH. The intimacy of this message, combined with the apparent expense of the gift, suggested a relationship between Nathaniel and Adeline that went beyond the conventional boundaries of their respective positions in New Orleans society. Further research by Bell uncovered a previously overlooked detail in the manumission papers. The document not only granted Adeline her freedom, but also transferred to her ownership of a small property on the outskirts of the city. According to tax records from 1838, the property had been purchased by Nathaniel Budro 6 months earlier. It consisted of a modest house and several acres of land, situated along what is now known as Gentilly Boulevard, but was then well outside the city limits. This provision suggests a level of planning and foresight that contradicts the theory of a hasty elopement. Nathaniel appears to have been methodically creating the conditions for Adeline to live as an independent woman, with the economic means to support herself. Such arrangements were not unprecedented in New Orleans during this period, but they were typically made more discreetly, often through intermediaries rather than direct transfers of property. The most compelling evidence regarding the fate of Nathaniel and Adeline emerged in 1962, when a collection of letters was discovered in the attic of a house being renovated in the Marigny district. The letters, spanning from September 1838 to July 1839, were written by someone identifying herself only as A to a recipient referred to as "dearest sister." They described life in a small community outside Boston, where the writer and her unnamed companion had settled after leaving New Orleans under circumstances too painful to commit to paper. The letters contain veiled references to their previous life, mentioning the necessity of our sudden departure and those who would prevent our happiness at any cost. One passage, dated December 1838, reads, "N. still suffers from the injury sustained during our journey, but the physician assures us that with time and proper care he will regain much of his former strength. I thank Providence daily that we escaped with our lives, though the price was dear." The authenticity of these letters has been debated among historians. The handwriting bears similarities to the signature on Adeline's manumission papers, but without more extensive samples for comparison, definitive attribution remains impossible. The paper and ink are consistent with materials available in the late 1830s, according to analysis conducted by the Historic New Orleans Collection in 1964. If genuine, these letters suggest that Nathaniel and Adeline survived whatever confrontation occurred near Bayou Saint. John, though not without injury, They apparently succeeded in reaching the northern states, where their relationship would have been less constrained by the rigid racial hierarchies of the antebellum South. The letters make no mention of marriage, but they clearly describe a life shared, with references to our home and our small garden, and plans for the future. The identity of the dearest sister remains unknown. Adeline Harper's family connections are not documented in surviving records, though it was not uncommon for enslaved individuals to maintain family ties even when physically separated by sale or inheritance. The possibility that she had a sister who was already free and living in the North is plausible, if unconfirmed. The last letter in the collection, dated July 23, 1839, expresses concern about unspecified rumors that have reached us from Louisiana. The writer states that they are considering another move, possibly to Canada, where we might find greater security in the knowledge that certain legal claims would hold no weight. This suggests that almost a year after their disappearance, Nathaniel and Adeline still feared pursuit or legal repercussions. No further correspondence has been discovered, and the historical record falls silent on their fate. Census records from Massachusetts and neighboring states for 1840 show no entries that can be definitively linked to either Nathaniel Budro or Adeline Harper under those names or any known aliases. The story might have ended there, consigned to the margins of history as an unusual but ultimately inconclusive case, were it not for a discovery made in 1965 during excavation for a new building near Porter Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Workers uncovered a small family cemetery that had been paved over sometime in the late 19th century. Among the graves was one marked with a simple stone bearing the initials AB and NB, and the dates 1815, 1872, and 1796, 1869, respectively. City records identified the plot as belonging to the Brown family, who had owned a small printing business in Cambridge from 1840 through 1880. According to tax documents, the business was established by Nathan Brown and wife Abigail, who were described as recently arrived from the South. A daguerreotype photograph from approximately 1855, found in the archives of the Cambridge Historical Society, shows an elderly man with a walking stick, seated beside a woman whose features suggest mixed racial ancestry, though the image quality makes definitive identification impossible. If Nathan and Abigail Brown were indeed Nathaniel Budro and Adeline Harper, living under assumed identities, they managed to create a new life far removed from the constraints of New Orleans society. The printing business appears to have been modestly successful, and records indicate that they were involved in local abolitionist activities, making small but regular contributions to anti-slavery publications and causes. She writes of glimpsing a face from the past at a literary society meeting, describing a moment of mutual recognition and equally mutual decision to acknowledge nothing. She continues, "Some ghosts are best left undisturbed, particularly when they have found peace in their haunting. This chance encounter, if indeed it was with the former Adeline Harper, suggests that the fears expressed in the final letter from 1939 eventually subsided enough for the couple to establish a public, if carefully circumspect, life in Massachusetts." Perhaps most intriguing is an entry in the diary of Caroline Reynolds, daughter of Thomas Reynolds, dated October 1857, during a visit to Boston. It also implies that whatever role the Reynolds family may have played in the events of 1838 by 1857, Caroline, at least, had made a kind of peace with the outcome. The graves in Cambridge were relocated during the 1965 construction project, the remains reinterred in Mount Auburn Cemetery with the original marker preserved. In 1968, on the 130th anniversary of the disappearance, A small ceremony was held at the grave site, attended primarily by historians and researchers who had studied the case. Among them was Dr. Eliza Johnson, a direct descendant of James Wilson, the notary whose seal appeared on Adeline's manumission papers. According to Dr. Johnson, family tradition held that her ancestor had indeed processed the papers, despite his public denial. Wilson had reportedly told his daughter, in confidence later shared with subsequent generations, that he had been visited late at night by a clearly agitated Nathaniel Budro, who insisted the documents be completed immediately and without the usual witnesses. Wilson had complied, sensing the urgency if not understanding its cause, only to learn days later of the couple's disappearance. His denial was motivated by fear of association with the scandal and possible legal complications. The Budro mansion on Prytania Street changed ownership again in 1969, purchased by a historical preservation society that restored it to its antebellum appearance. Tour guides now mention the disappearance of Nathaniel and Adeline as part of the house's colorful history, though the narrative presented focuses more on romantic elopement than on the darker possibilities suggested by the evidence. The carriage site near Bayou St. John has been absorbed by urban development, the exact location now uncertain. Local residents still occasionally report unusual sounds, on particularly still nights, the distant clatter of wheels, or the soft splash of something entering the water. Such stories are embraced as part of New Orleans' rich paranormal tradition, regardless of their historical validity. What remains beyond dispute is that in the summer of 1838, two people vanished from a society that would not accommodate their relationship. The evidence suggests they may have survived to build a life elsewhere, though not without struggle and sacrifice. Their story, pieced together from fragments across more than a century, speaks to the human capacity for both cruelty and courage, for violence and endurance. The graves in Mount Auburn Cemetery bear only initials, their true identities still a matter of historical debate. Perhaps that ambiguity is fitting, a final act of privacy for two people who sought against considerable odds to determine their own fate in a world that denied them that right. The silence that surrounds much of their story is not empty, but filled with the unspoken. Choices made, prices paid, and promises kept despite everything arrayed against them. In the end, what we know for certain about Nathaniel Budro and Adeline Harper is far outweighed by what remains hidden. The records are incomplete, the witnesses long gone. What persists is the outline of a narrative that challenges our understanding of the past and invites us to consider the countless other stories that never made it into the archives, the lives lived in margins and shadows, seeking spaces of freedom in a world of constraints. Perhaps the most eloquent statement on the case comes from the final page of Robert Bell's Silenced Narratives, published in 1968, just months before his death. History is not merely what is documented, but also what is deliberately undocumented, not just what is said, but what is carefully left unsaid. In the spaces between official records, in contradictions and convenient omissions, we glimpse the true complexity of the past and recognize how often the most human stories are those deemed too dangerous to tell. The pocket watch, recovered near Bayou St. John, with its hidden inscription, remains in the collection of the Louisiana State Museum. Visitors who ask to see it are sometimes told it is not currently on display, or that it has been temporarily removed for conservation. Some staff members, speaking unofficially, suggest that the watch has a peculiar habit of stopping at precisely 13 minutes past 10, regardless of how recently it has been wound. Whether this is mechanical failure, coincidence, or something less easily explained remains, like so much else in this story, a matter of conjecture. On August 13, 1838, a carriage traveled the dark road alongside Bayou St. John. What happened there has echoed through generations. transformed by time from scandal to mystery to legend. The truth lies buried in fragments: a pocket watch, a handful of letters, an unmarked grave far from home. Some doors, once closed, remain so for reasons that outlive those who shut them, and some promises, once made, continue to resonate long after those who made them have returned to dust. In 1963, an elderly woman named Martha Collins contacted the Louisiana Historical Society with a curious claim. According to family documents passed down through generations, her great-grandmother had been a housekeeper for the Reynolds family in the late 1830s. The woman, whose name was recorded as Sarah Jenkins, had allegedly witnessed an intense argument between Thomas Reynolds and Nathaniel Budro just days before the disappearance. Collins submitted several pages from what appeared to be a personal journal, in which Sarah described overhearing Reynolds threaten Budro regarding the impropriety of certain attachments and the consequences of pursuing such a ruinous course. The authenticity of these journal pages has been questioned by some historians, particularly as they surfaced more than a century after the events they describe. Handwriting analysis conducted in 1964 was inconclusive, though the paper was consistent with materials available in the 19th century. Whether genuine or not, the account aligns with other evidence suggesting that the Reynolds family had both personal and professional grievances with Nathaniel Budro in the months leading up to his disappearance. What is documented beyond dispute is that Thomas Reynolds' shipping company experienced a significant expansion in late 1838 and 1839, acquiring several routes and contracts previously controlled by Budro interests. Business records from the period show that Reynolds purchased the outstanding shares of Budro's company at prices well below market value, transactions approved by Elizabeth Budro as executor of her son's estate. The timing of these acquisitions, coming so soon after Nathaniel's disappearance, has been viewed by some researchers as suggestive of opportunism at the very least. In 1966, architectural historian Edward Lambert, conducting research on antebellum homes in New Orleans, discovered a previously unknown space in the Budro mansion on Prytania Street. During an examination of the building's original floor plans, Lambert identified inconsistencies in the dimensions of the second floor. Careful measurement revealed a narrow space between the master bedroom and the adjacent sitting room, accessible only through a concealed door in what had been Nathaniel's private study. This hidden room, approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, contained no windows and appeared to have been sealed sometime in the late 19th century. Inside, Lambert found nothing but an empty shelf and the remains of what might have been a small desk or writing table. The walls bore traces of what he described as extensive water damage, though the surrounding rooms showed no signs of similar deterioration. Lambert's report, filed with the Historic New Orleans Collection, speculates that the room might have served as a secure storage space for business documents or valuables. However, given the context of Nathaniel's relationship with Adeline, some historians have proposed an alternative theory that the room might have been used for clandestine meetings, or perhaps as temporary accommodations for Adeline during periods when her presence in the main household would have raised questions. This theory gained additional support in 1967, when restoration work on the mansion uncovered a small cache of items concealed behind a loose brick in the hidden room's wall. The items included a silver locket containing a lock of dark hair, a small notebook filled with what appeared to be poetry written in a feminine hand, and a carefully folded document that crumbled upon exposure to air. Before disintegrating, the partial text visible on the document suggested it might have been a ship's passenger manifest or booking confirmation. The notebook contained no explicit identification of its author, but several poems made references to eyes the color of the Mississippi in winter, and hands that built empires, yet tremble at my touch. One entry, dated June 4th, 1838, reads, "2 months until freedom comes on paper, what has long existed in heart." Then the journey begins, across water to shores where we might simply be. This timeline corresponds with Adeline's manumission in early August and the subsequent disappearance, suggesting that their departure had been planned well in advance. The existence of this hidden room and its contents raises intriguing possibilities about the nature of Nathaniel and Adeline's relationship prior to her manumission. It suggests a degree of intimacy and planning that extended beyond a sudden decision to flee together. The fact that these items remained concealed in the house rather than taken with them may indicate that their final departure was more rushed or occurred under different circumstances than originally intended. In October 1968, a graduate student in American literature named Rebecca Martin made a potentially significant discovery while researching 19th-century abolitionist publications. In an obscure Boston literary journal called The Liberty Bell, published in 1842, she found a short story titled The Promise, attributed to A.B. The story describes a couple fleeing New Orleans under cover of darkness, pursued by men hired by the woman's former owner. The fictional couple eventually reaches safety in Massachusetts, where they live under assumed names, though the man never fully recovers from his injuries, and the woman is haunted by the knowledge that blood was the price of our beginning. The story concludes with the couple visiting the grave of their pursuers, a place where flowers now bloom over old hatreds. While the story is presented as fiction, certain details correspond so closely with the known facts of the Budro Harper case that many scholars believe it may be a thinly veiled account of actual events. In the narrative, the couple is intercepted near a bayou, leading to a violent confrontation that leaves the man seriously wounded and one of their pursuers dead. The description of the bayou setting, the specific nature of the man's injuries, a gunshot wound to the leg that leaves him permanently lame, and the references to the cotton trade all suggest autobiographical elements. If A.B. was indeed Adeline, writing under her assumed identity of Abigail Brown, this story provides the most detailed account available of what might have occurred on the night of August 13th, 1838. It suggests that the couple was ambushed during their attempted escape, resulting in violence that left physical and psychological scars. The reference to visiting the grave of their pursuers remains enigmatic, as no records exist of any Reynolds family members or associates being buried in Massachusetts. The journal The Liberty Bell was published annually as a fundraiser for the anti-slavery movement, featuring contributions from both established and amateur writers. Its 1842 edition included works by several prominent abolitionists, including Wendell Phillips and Maria Weston Chapman. The inclusion of The Promise suggests that by that time A.B. had established at least some connections within Boston's abolitionist circles. Further research by Martin uncovered additional publications possibly attributable to the same author in various reform-oriented periodicals throughout the 1840s and 50s. These included essays on education for freed slaves, the moral imperative of the abolitionist cause, and, interestingly, a piece advocating for the legal recognition of marriages across racial lines. This last essay, published in 1849, argued that love, once awakened, recognizes no boundaries of color or condition, and the laws that would constrain it are an affront to both nature and God. The Cambridge printing business owned by Nathan and Abigail Brown was responsible for producing several of these publications, according to printers' marks and business records from the period. The modest operation appears to have specialized in reform-oriented literature, suggesting that if Nathaniel and Adeline did indeed establish new lives as the Browns, they remained committed to the cause of abolition and racial equality, even as they maintained a low profile, to protect their own security. The grave site in Mount Auburn Cemetery became a point of interest for historians and civil rights activists in the 1960s. In 1968, during the height of the civil rights movement, a small bronze plaque was added near the original stone marker reading, "Here may lie Nathaniel Budro and Adeline Harper, whose quest for love and freedom defied the boundaries of their time. Their story reminds us that the struggle for human dignity has many unsung heroes." The conditional phrasing acknowledges the ongoing historical uncertainty while honoring the symbolic importance of their story. The same year, historian Caroline Jefferson conducted an exhaustive search of Cambridge city records from 1840 through 1872, the year of Abigail Brown's death according to the grave marker. She discovered that the Browns had purchased their home on Magazine Street in 1842, having previously rented rooms above their print shop. Tax records indicate a modest but growing prosperity over the years, with the business expanding to include a small bookshop by 1850. Most significantly, Jefferson found a death certificate for Abigail Brown, dated April 17, 1872. The cause of death was listed as consumption, tuberculosis, and her age was recorded as approximately 57 years, which would align with the estimated birth year of Adeline Harper. The document identified her birthplace simply as Louisiana and was signed by Dr. William Harrison, a physician known to have treated many in Cambridge's small black community. Nathan Brown's death certificate from 1869 listed complications from long-standing injury to the lower extremity as contributing to his demise, with pneumonia as the immediate cause. His birthplace was recorded as New Orleans, and his occupation as printer and bookseller. The document was witnessed by Abigail Brown, identified as his wife, and by James Brown, described as his son. The existence of this son, previously unknown to researchers, opened new avenues of inquiry. Jefferson's continued research revealed that James Brown, born approximately 1844, according to census records, attended Oberlin College in Ohio, one of the few institutions of higher education open to black students at the time. He later returned to Cambridge, where he worked in the family printing business and was active in local politics during Reconstruction. If James was indeed the son of Nathaniel Budro and Adeline Harper, his birth in 1844 would indicate that the couple had established themselves sufficiently in their new identities to start a family within a few years of their flight from New Orleans. Census records from 1850 describe James as mulatto, suggesting that Abigail's mixed-race heritage was acknowledged, at least to census takers, rather than concealed entirely. The fate of James Brown after his parents' deaths remained unclear until 1969, when Jefferson discovered a newspaper notice from 1874 announcing his relocation to Washington, D.C., where he had accepted a position with the Freedmen's Bureau. Subsequent records indicate that he married a schoolteacher named Clara Williams in 1876 and had 3 children. His descendants, unaware of their possible connection to the Budro-Harper story, continued to live in the Washington area into the 20th century. In 1967, Dr. Robert Bell, whose silenced narratives had brought renewed attention to the case, received an anonymous package containing a small leather-bound book. The book, its pages brittle with age, appeared to be a personal diary covering the period from September 1838 to December 1842. The entries, written in a precise hand, detailed the early years of life in Massachusetts for N and A following their escape from New Orleans. According to these entries, the couple initially lived in Salem, Massachusetts, before moving to Cambridge in 1840 to establish the printing business. The writer, presumably Nathan, described ongoing pain from a gunshot wound to his right leg and occasional nightmares about the events at the bayou. He mentioned regular correspondence with A's sister in Philadelphia, who apparently served as an intermediary for receiving news from New Orleans. One entry from July 1839 described their reaction to learning of R's unexpected demise, noting that, though one cannot rejoice in another's death, there is undeniable relief in knowing that particular shadow no longer darkens our path. This may refer to Thomas Reynolds, who, according to New Orleans obituary records, died suddenly in June 1839 from what was described as apoplexy, likely a stroke. The diary also contained references to a growing circle of trusted friends in abolitionist circles, though it noted that even among those committed to the cause, our particular circumstances require discretion. Several entries mentioned visits from William Lloyd Garrison, the prominent abolitionist publisher, who apparently offered advice on developing their printing business to serve reform-oriented publications. Most poignantly, the diary recorded the couple's reactions to the birth of their son in February 1844. The entry, longer and more emotional than most, described the event as the culmination of a promise made years ago beside moon-dappled waters, when we pledged that whatever life we might forge would be truly free, not just for ourselves, but for any who might come after. Today, holding him in my arms, I know that every risk was justified, every sacrifice worthwhile. The authenticity of this diary has been debated among historians, particularly as the identity of the sender remains unknown. Bell himself, in his final interview before his death in 1968, expressed his belief that the diary was genuine, citing details that correlated with independently verified facts about the Browns' life in Massachusetts. He speculated that the diary might have been preserved by descendants of James Brown, who had recently discovered its significance, but wished to remain anonymous due to the complicated racial history it represented. In 1968, the New Orleans City Council considered a proposal to rename a small park near Bayou St. John in honor of Nathaniel Budro and Adeline Harper. The proposal, introduced by the city's first black councilman, sparked intense debate. Opponents argued that the historical identification remained uncertain and that honoring an interracial relationship from the antebellum period might be seen as divisive rather than unifying. Supporters countered that the story, whether precisely factual or partially legendary, represented important themes of courage and resistance to unjust social constraints. The compromise solution was the installation of a simple stone bench at the approximate location where the carriage had been found, bearing the inscription, "In remembrance of all those whose stories of love and courage remain untold." The bench was dedicated in a small ceremony on August 13, 1969, the 131st anniversary of the disappearance. Among those present at the dedication was an elderly woman named Clara Williams, identified in newspaper accounts as a great-granddaughter of James Brown of Cambridge. Williams, then in her 70s, had traveled from Washington specifically for the ceremony. In a brief statement to the Times-Picayune, she acknowledged that family tradition had long included stories of ancestors who had fled the South under difficult circumstances, though specific connections to the Budro Harper narrative had only recently been discovered through the work of historians like Jefferson and Bell. Williams described finding letters and photographs in her grandmother's effects after her death in 1953, items that had been carefully preserved but rarely discussed. Among them was a daguerreotype believed to be of Nathan and Abigail Brown in their later years, and a letter from Abigail to her son James, written shortly before her death, in which she reflected on the journey of her life. The letter, subsequently donated to the historic New Orleans collection, contains what many consider the most direct confirmation of Abigail Brown's identity as the former Adeline Harper. In it, she wrote, "The name under which I have lived these many years was not the one given to me at birth, nor the one under which I first knew both bondage and its ending. But it became truly mine through choice rather than imposition, and in that lies a freedom more profound than mere legal status." She continued, "What happened that night by the water's edge changed us both in ways beyond the physical scars your father carried to his grave. I have never spoken of it fully, not even to you, my son. Some memories are best left undisturbed, like the still waters of the bayou that witness much but reveal little. Know only that the life we built here, the family we created, grew from soil watered with both blood and tears, and that its flowering has been the redemption of all that came before." The letter concludes with a request that after her death, her wedding ring should be buried with her, returning to the earth the symbol of a promise that defied a world arranged to prevent it. According to cemetery records, when Abigail Brown was interred beside her husband in 1872, her son honored this request. In 1969, as part of the ongoing restoration of the Budro mansion, workers discovered a small recess behind the fireplace in Nathaniel's study. Inside was a miniature portrait of a young woman whose features suggested mixed racial ancestry. The portrait, executed on ivory in the style common in the 1830s, bore no signature or identification. Art historians who examined the piece noted its exceptional quality and estimated its value as considerable, suggesting that it had been commissioned from one of the more accomplished portraitists working in New Orleans at the time. The woman in the portrait wears a simple blue dress with a white collar, her dark hair arranged in the fashion of the period. Most striking are her eyes, which one historian described as conveying a sense of quiet determination beneath their surface calm. The portrait now hangs in the historic New Orleans collection, labeled simply "Unknown Woman, c. 1837", though many visitors recognize it as the presumed image of Adeline Harper. The story of Nathaniel Budro and Adeline Harper, pieced together from fragments across more than a century, remains incomplete. Historical certainty eludes us, as it often does when examining lives lived in opposition to the prevailing structures of their time. What evidence exists suggests that they may have succeeded in their quest for a life together, though at considerable cost. Their journey from the rigid constraints of antebellum New Orleans to the relative freedom of Massachusetts represents not just a physical distance traversed, but a crossing of the boundaries that their society had established as immutable. In the decades following the Civil War and Reconstruction, as the promise of racial equality receded under the weight of Jim Crow laws and renewed segregation, the story of Nathaniel and Adeline might have offered a different vision of possibility had it not been submerged beneath layers of silence and deliberate forgetting. It re-emerged in the mid-20th century alongside renewed struggles for civil rights and racial justice, a reminder that resistance to oppressive systems has many forms, some dramatic and public, others intimate and hidden. If the Browns of Cambridge were indeed the former Nathaniel Budro and Adeline Harper, they created a life that embodied the principles of freedom and equality in both personal and political dimensions. Their printing business served the Abolitionist movement that sought to end the system from which they had fled. Their son received an education and opportunities that would have been unthinkable for him in the South. Their marriage, while perhaps never fully acknowledged in public, appears to have endured for more than 30 years, sustained by mutual commitment in the face of extraordinary challenges. The pocket watch, recovered near Bayou Saint. John, with its hidden inscription promising a future that time might treat kindly, remains one of the few tangible connections to their story. Whether that promise was ultimately fulfilled is a question each person who encounters their story must answer for themselves. What seems clear is that in a world determined to deny their humanity and connection, Nathaniel and Adeline chose to define their own path, regardless of the consequences. Their graves in Mount Auburn Cemetery, marked only with initials and dates, lie beneath towering oaks in one of the first garden cemeteries in America, a place designed to celebrate life even in its commemoration of death. Visitors sometimes leave flowers or small stones, traditional tokens of remembrance in many cultures. The bench near Bayou Saint. In his final public lecture before his death, historian Robert Bell observed that history is not merely a record of what happened, but a conversation about what matters. The story of Nathaniel Budro and Adeline Harper matters because it reminds us that behind the broad strokes of historical narrative, slavery, abolition, civil war, Reconstruction, lie countless individual lives, each with its own complex negotiation of constraint and possibility, courage and compromise, love and loss. John, far to the south, offers a different kind of memorial, a place for reflection on all the stories that history has not fully preserved or acknowledged. The carriage that travelled alongside Bayou St. John on that August night in 1838 carried two people determined to create a future different from what their society had prescribed for them. What happened on that journey changed not just their lives, but eventually our understanding of the past they inhabited. Their story, emerging from shadows after more than a century, invites us to consider how many other stories remain untold, how many other lives defy the categories and assumptions that shape our view of history. In the end, perhaps the most profound aspect of their legacy lies not in what we know, but in what we question about the past, about human capacity for both cruelty and courage, and about the enduring power of promises made against all odds.